I learned the shape of betrayal from the sound of a latch slipping into place. Late light turned the kitchen syrupy. I stood at the sink in my father-in-law's house, hands wet from washing his teacups, when the back door gave a quiet metal sigh and a whisper slid down the hallway. Not words, just intent. The regulator clock in the hall ticked like a metronome for conscience. I shut off the tap. A floorboard answered. Anne. My father-in-law called from the den. He always said my name like he was checking the world was still where he left it. I'm here, I said. Your water's boiling. Vieri tu I. He grunted contentment, and I built his tray the way I always did, porcelain cup with faded cornflowers, 2 shortbread cookies, his pill organizer in a neat line, a draft threaded under the kitchen door, the kind a house gets when another door opens and closes quietly. In the den, sunlight pooled on his lap blanket. Harold looked smaller than a man who once ran a hardware store and could judge a bolt by touch. You always remember the lemon, he said as I floated a slice in his tea. My mother taught me to listen, I said, and to notice when someone's trying not to be noticed. End quote. He smiled. I tucked the blanket, waited for the tea to steep. Another floorboard spoke. Maybe the house settling? Maybe the future testing its weight. I kissed his temple and told myself love is careful habits turning off lights, counting pills, noticing drafts, and that whatever it was could wait until the tea cooled. I tau no, and to read it is Ruli too no, I town of the Newmont. Before I married into the Whitakers, people said their name like a reliable recipe. Casseroles arrived hot at church potlucks. Fences didn't sag. Daniel wore the name like a pressed shirt. When we met, he said, I made a room steadier. His father didn't need noise. He needed a witness. I wanted to be that witness. I came from a smaller house with thinner walls. We let love do the talking because money had to be careful. Being good isn't loud, my mother said. It's what you do when no one's watching. In Daniel's family, I would be that kind of good. When Harold's memory began to misfile faces and days, I came by after work. I made his tea, stacked his mail from newest to oldest bold envelopes on top, brochures on bottom. He could still tell you what a proper hammer should weigh, but he'd ask if I'd seen his ring and I'd tap the chain around his neck. We learned patience with each other's gaps. Daniel said he was grateful. His sister, Mel, was drowning in drop-offs. His brother, Kyle, traveled. You've become the daughter he never had, Daniel told me while we folded laundry. You belong with us. It's dawn round. Harold's house smelled like wood polish and clean tools. 1,000 careful Saturdays had paid it off. On Sundays, the family filled those rooms like a hymn. Mel brought salad that pretended to be healthy. Kyle brought borrowed jokes. Daniel brought wine we couldn't afford because he believed appearances lend dignity. I brought the gravy that never broke. Harold bragged, Anne makes it the old way. I'd pretend embarrassment and feel the frame of our life sitting square. And yet, off-key notes crept in before the latch. A grocery receipt with items I hadn't bought in Harold's mail. A voicemail from a realtor Daniel called a wrong number. Mel's eyes flicking to Kyle when Harold asked for car keys he no longer used. Not alarms, just pebbles in my shoe. I told myself to be gracious, to steady rooms and keep the peace like a good table keeps dishes from sliding. But peace can get so quiet it stops being honest. Daniel's phone started living face down. Harold's laugh shortened. Mel cleaned too fast, like outrunning a thought. Kyle rubbed the back of his neck whenever anyone said paperwork. To cabe it high. I kept showing up. Tea at 2:30. Pills at 3. Locks checked at night. If love is a habit, I would make a habit of trust. Beautiful. Dangerous. The day of the latch. After I settled Harold's blanket, I stood in the doorway and listened to the house listen back. The kettle clicked as it cooled. I followed the draft into the hallway. Nothing visibly wrong. The runner a little off-center. A family photo leaning a breath to the left. In the picture, Harold's late wife held Daniel as a boy. All elbows and cowlick. Chin tipped like he could already see the name carved ahead of Hyen. A boy tries to grow into a family story. There is loyalty in that. There is danger, too. If the story starts paying itself in someone else's currency. Anne, Harold called. Did I tell you about the tie-in I sold a crate of bolts to a man who only needed 6? Why? I sat. You gave the rest back, I said, and told Hyen to bring measurements next tie-in. 2. He chuckled. Honesty takes longer, he said. But it's cheaper in the end. It's one with ops like an... Outside, a car engine coughed too far to be ours, close enough to feel like an answer. I didn't go to the window. I took his paper-thin hand and felt how age pairs a person to essentials. He squeezed back. Do you need anything else? I asked. Just you, he said, softer. And a house that doesn't move when I close my eyes. End quote. I thought of the latch and whisper, the draft and lemon, the tipped frame, the groceries I didn't buy, the realtor's wrong number. I smoothed the blanket and did what good daughters-in-law do. In my phone I noted, T230, pills 3. Call Dr. Redosage. Ask Daniel about water bill. Check back door latch. I kissed Harold's temple. I'll bring stew tomorrow. It's not never. He nodded like he could already taste it. On my way out, I straightened the photo. A small fix. A wish disguised as repair. The house exhaled. I couldn't know the heavier frame, the one holding the story of who we were, already hung by a single wire. I drove home through the soft gold of evening, telling myself honesty takes longer and that I had TNE. For one more night. I believed I did. The first real crack came dressed as kindness. It was a Tuesday morning in March, one of those days when winter can't decide whether to stay or leave. I stopped by Harold's house early with a basket of muffins and a list of questions for the visiting nurse. When I turned the key, I found Daniel already there, a surprise. Since he'd told me he had an early meeting, he was in the study, half bent over a box of papers, his jacket still on. Morning, I said lightly. You're up early. 18:07. He jumped a little, then smiled too fast. Just checking on Dad's insurance stuff. You know, keeping things organized. What's 9? I wanted to believe Hyen, but there was a tremor in the air, a faint wrong note, like a violin slightly off tune. I noticed a folder on the desk labeled Property Taxes, 2023. It wasn't Harold's handwriting. The edges were new, the ink too sharp. Did the insurance company ask for this? I asked. Daniel hesitated. Something like that. Then he added, I'm trying to take the load off you. You've been running yourself ragged. It's Duard. It was a perfect answer, caring, generous, considerate. Exactly the kind of answer you give when you don't want anyone to look too closely. I brushed the muffin crumbs from my sleeve and said, You're sweet. But as I set the basket down, I noticed the faint outline of a realtor's business card tucked beneath the papers. The corner of it read, Marlowe Realty Group. I filed the name away. There's no towel, or spied like active video exploitation. That night at dinner, I asked Daniel how his meeting went. He said it was fine, though he never mentioned what kind of meeting it was. He ate quickly, eyes on his phone, and asked if I'd be able to stop by his father's tomorrow. Mel's coming with Kyle, he said. They want to talk about plans. Is Maber Prusen. Plans for what? Ninth. He paused, then said, Just the usual medical. Finances. Dad's future. I was not adding. I smiled because that's what a good wife does when she's unsure whether to be alarmed or grateful. But later, after he fell asleep, I lay awake listening to the rain hit the window. soft but relentless. The word plans rolled around my head. I thought about that realtor's card and the new folder. Something about the timing was wrong. Harold's condition had declined, but he still knew who he was, where he was, and what he wanted. He had never once mentioned selling anything. And it is spurious. The next afternoon, I drove over during lunch break. Harold was in his chair by the window, watching the rain streak the glass. They told me I should rest, he said. I don't know why people always want me to rest. I've been resting for 70 years. End quote. His humor was still sharp, but something in his eyes looked tired. Did Daniel or Mel come by? I asked. He frowned. Maybe yesterday. Or maybe I dreamed it. They were talking about the old place. End quote. The old place. Is wide. The one with the maple trees. Your husband's mama planted one herself. He smiled faintly. They said it wasn't safe anymore, that the foundation's sinking. But that house has stood longer than their marriage. I was not a Vader. My stomach dropped. Who said that? Very too. He blinked slowly. Uncertain. They all did. I told them they could move whatever they needed to, but the papers they said I already had. I was not have sent it. I crouched beside Hyan. Papers. What papers? I no doubt. He waved a thin hand toward the coffee table. A few pages sat there, folded and neat. The top one had Harold's name printed in heavy black letters. Beneath it, smaller text read, Transfer of Ownership Agreement. End quote. My heart thudded. I skyenmed the first lines. And even before I reached the signatures, I felt heat rise behind my eyes. There it was, Harold Whitaker, signature uneven, trembling. Below, Daniel's name. And next to his, Mel's and Kyle's. Witness lines empty. Date, last Thursday. Who asked you to sign this? I whispered. I don't remember, Harold said softly. They said it would make things easier. Less paperwork for you. It's really be oft of were. The words twisted like a knife. For me? I folded the pages gently, as if too much pressure might make them disappear, then slid them back where I found them. Don't worry, I said. I'll handle it. If we. But as I looked at Hyan, his thin fingers trembling around the teacup, his half-buttoned sweater, the trust written all over his face, I knew this wasn't just about a house. It was about decency. About what people do when they think no one is watching. I left quietly that day, the rain now falling harder, the road shimmering like glass. My hands gripped the wheel until my knuckles whitened. I replayed every moment, the whisper behind the door, Daniel's too smooth smile, the new folder, the card from Marlowe Realty. There's a moment when you begin to suspect betrayal, that your mind tries to save you. It tells you you're imagining things, that good people don't do bad things, that families may argue, but they don't deceive. I wanted to believe that. I really did. But the world outside the windshield blurred, and I realized I wasn't crying because I was angry. I was crying because deep down, I already knew I was right. I was re-school about the scansa. That night, I set a reminder on my phone. Call Marlowe Realty, pretend to inquire about the Maple Street property. If there's one thing my mother taught me, it's this. When something doesn't add up, don't shout. Count. Count every missing piece until the truth balances the scale. And I was about to start counting. When I called the number on the Marlowe Realty card the next morning, I didn't use my name. Good afternoon, I said, pitching my voice a little higher. I'm calling about a listing I saw mentioned, a property on Maple Street. I was told it might be available soon. Is not a ven. The receptionist's tone brightened. Professional, but friendly. Yes. That one's under contract already. Ma'am. A quick turnaround, the Whitaker estate sale. Closing next week. We're livin' to consider. Estate sale. The phrase hit like cold water. Oh, I managed. That's wonderful for them. Could you tell me who's handling the sale? One of our senior agents, Mr. Lang. He's not in at the moment, but I can leave a note. Are you related to the sellers? If you wanted. For a heartbeat, I said nothing. I watched the steam from my coffee twist upward, then vanish. No, I said, too softly. Not anymore. End quote. I hung up before she could ask anything else. 2. Of relived way that intellentry on the certain 24. By the time Danielle came home that night, I'd already read through our household papers twice, searching for anything, any mention of Harold's property, a joint account, a power of attorney. Nothing. He walked in humming, dropped his briefcase, and kissed my cheek like it was any other evening. How was your day? He asked. Quiet. I wanted to wait, to pick my moment, but the words kept crawling up my throat. You didn't tell me you were selling your father's house. I really tone. He froze, then smiled with the kind of calm only people who've practiced lying can manage. Anne, it's complicated. We're just helping Hyan downsize. It's for his own good. It's a starting. By transferring ownership without witnesses. My voice shook. I saw the papers. Daniel. He didn't even understand what he was signing. I would. His smile faltered. You shouldn't be looking through private documents. As work. They were on the coffee table. It's a distance time. He sighed a tired, almost parental sound. You don't understand how fragile he's become. The taxes. The upkeep. He can't manage it anymore. None of us can. Selling was the responsible thing. Responsible. I repeated. You call stealing from your father responsible. I did 9. He ran a hand through his hair. It's not stealing. The money's going into a family fund. For medical care. For everyone's benefit. If San's off to. Everyone except Hyan. And of course. Silence swelled between us, thick and electric. Outside, a dog barked somewhere down the street. The refrigerator hummed. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Finally, he said, you've always had a soft spot for my dad, but you need to let go of this savior complex. He's old. Anne, he doesn't even know what day it is half the time. We're just trying to make things easier. It's that was never ponces. Easier. That word, said so gently, scraped across me like glass. You could have told me, I whispered. You let me make his meals, pay his bills, tuck Hyan in every night while you plotted behind his back. It's not 8-9. He slammed his hand on the counter. Enough. You're acting like we're villains. Mel and Kyle agreed this was best. If you can't trust your own husband, maybe you should rethink what kind of family you want to be part of. Is my talks of the craze? He stormed out before I could answer. The door shut hard, shaking the frame. I stood there, surrounded by the echo. And in Unabadair with, for the next few days, I played the part I'd perfected, the quiet, dutiful daughter-in-law. I brought soup to Harold, folded his laundry, and smiled at Mel when she stopped by pretending concern. But behind the calm, I was gathering pieces. On Wednesday, I called Marlowe Realty again. This TN I asked for Mr. Lang directly. He confirmed the sale price far lower than market value. I asked who signed the documents. All 3 Whitaker siblings, he said. Their father too. Of course. They mentioned you'd moved out of state. 10. Moved out of state. I thanked Hyan, hung up, and sat perfectly still until the walls seemed to tilt. They hadn't just stolen the house. They'd erased me from the story altogether. That night, while Daniel slept, I went through his briefcase. Inside was a manila envelope labeled Maple Sant Transfer. I spread the contents across the table: bank statements, checks, a handwritten note from Mel. Deposit into joint account before Dad notices the balance. The ink looked rushed. A smear near the signature where she'd probably hesitated. I took photos of everything. Every page, every date, every dollar. Then I put it all back exactly as I found it. It is great my Brandon helpin'. On Friday, I stopped by Harold's again. He was half asleep in his chair, soft sunlight across his face. "Morning, sweetheart," he murmured. "They said I won't be here much longer." I was braided. My breath caught. "Who said that?" "I have dogged. Daniel. He said we'd be moving soon. Some facility with nurses." Eyes sand. My chest tightened. "Did you agree to that?" "To have say vine." He frowned, struggling to remember. "I told Hyan I'd go anywhere if it meant you'd still visit. He said you were busy now, working far away. If we have not people." The room blurred. I knelt beside Hyan, holding his hand. "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." I revered. He looked at me, confused. "You always were a good girl," he whispered. "Better than my own sometiens. It must know." That was when something inside me clicked. A quiet, steel certainty. They could sell the house, the furniture, the inheritance, but they would not take his dignity. I weighed. The following morning, I went to the county clerk's office. The clerk, a gray-haired woman with sharp glasses, helped me pull up the property records. The new deed had already been recorded. Ownership transferred to Whitaker Holdings, LLC. "Looks like a family corporation," she said. "Filed last week." Num. The sale price, $180. 000. Far below market value. The buyer's contact email: whitakerfinancial@gmail.com. Mel's address. My stomach turned. As I left, the clerk called after me. "You might want to talk to the Elder Affairs Division. Ma'am, if there's concern about coercion, they can help." Ingredients. Coercion. The word landed like a key turning in a lock. By the tie-in, I reached the parking lot. I had already made up my mind. I wasn't going to shout or threaten. I was going to document. I collected copies of the deed, the sale record, and the emails I'd found. I printed the photos from Daniel's briefcase and filed everything into a plain blue folder. When I looked at the cover, I realized my hands weren't shaking anymore. For the first tie-in in weeks, I felt calm. Because when people lie long enough, they forget that truth has its own kind of patience. It waits. It watches. And when the tie-in is right, it opens its mouth. Mine would open at the next family gathering. And the sound of it would not be a whisper behind a door, it would be the latch breaking clean off its hinge. The family gathering was supposed to be a celebration. Mel had called it a small get-together to mark Harold's birthday early, a warm Sunday afternoon filled with laughter, casserole dishes, and polite lies. She sent a cheerful group text about making memories before the big move. I replied with a simple thumbs-up emoji. Daniel assumed I'd moved past the argument. For 3 days, he'd been kind again, making coffee in the mornings, sending casual texts like nothing had happened. He didn't realize kindness can be camouflage. On the morning of the gathering, I woke before dawn. The sky was colorless, the air cold with promise. I laid out Harold's favorite cardigan, the one with the wooden buttons, and baked his lemon loaf from scratch. The recipe, he always said, reminded Hyan of his wife. As it cooled, I packed my blue folder neatly at the bottom of my tote bag. Every photo, every document, every record I'd gathered now lay in quiet order. When I pulled up to the old Whitaker house, I paused in the driveway. The maple trees flanked the yard like sentries, I thought of how Harold used to sweep their fallen leaves into tidy piles, whistling off-key. The house looked peaceful, unaware it had been sold out from under Hyen. Inside, Mel fluttered from room to room, performing joy. "Anne, you made it," she chirped, her arms already outstretched. "You look radiant. If you, everyone..." "Thank you," I said evenly. "It's good to see everyone together." 2. Kyle was in the living room, balancing a beer on his knee, watching a muted sports channel. Daniel poured drinks at the counter, his laugh easy, his confidence rehearsed. And Harold sat in his chair by the window, sweater slightly crooked, eyes bright at the sight of me. "There's my girl," he said. "Did you bring the lemon cake?" "If you could not stew." "Of course I did." I knelt beside Hyen, straightening his buttons. "Happy birthday, Harold." "I'm 7. Is it my birthday?" He chuckled. "I lose track." End quote. Mel clapped her hands. "We figured we'd celebrate early since things will be changing soon. New beginnings. Right. Ivnite. New beginnings. Such a pretty phrase for dispossession." Daniel's voice cut in, cheerful and false. "Dad, we found you a wonderful assisted living place. You'll have your own room, nurses, gardens." "I like my own house," Harold said quietly. Mel shot Hyen a look. "We just want you safe, Dad." "Is this too wire?" I watched her hand rest lightly on his shoulder, too light, like a touch for show. Something inside me steadied, as if every nerve finally aligned. I rose slowly. "Maybe we should all sit down for a minute. There's something I'd like to share." Mel blinked. "Now." "I have." "Yes. Now." "I know." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Anne, this isn't the Tien. I was C2 Verlive." I smiled, soft and calm. "Actually, I think it's exactly the Tien." "I know." I took the blue folder from my bag and set it on the coffee table. "Harold," I said gently, "do you remember signing some papers last week?" End quote. He frowned. "I sign a lot of things these days." "Inforted." "I know. These were for your house." I did 9. He blinked, confused. "My house. Did I sell something?" "Even way too in bought a band." Before anyone could interrupt, I opened the folder and spread the copies out like cards on a table. "This," I said, tapping the deed, "is the transfer document. It says your home was sold to a company your children created, Whitaker Holdings. The sale price was far below market value. And here," I lifted another page, "are the emails about the bank deposits, all dated before you even signed." I miled. The room went silent, except for the clock ticking in the hall. Mel laughed weakly. "Anne, you're misunderstanding. This is a family arrangement." I met Xerabot. "Then why file it under an LLC?" I asked. "Why tell the realtor Harold's family had moved out of state?" I said. Kyle swore under his breath. Daniel stepped forward, face hardening. "You had no right to dig through my things." "Eyes." "I had every right," I said evenly. "Because while you were forging signatures and pocketing cash, I was the one feeding Hyen, bathing Hyen, and listening to Hyen forget the world. I had the right to protect Hyen since his own children wouldn't." "I know." Mel's voice trembled. "We were just trying to secure your inheritance." I finished for her. "You already did. If you work an emulation of video." Harold looked from face to face, bewildered. "Is this true?" he whispered. "You sold the house." End quote. Daniel dropped his gaze. "Dad, it was falling apart. We just wanted to simplify things." "I have crass." "Without telling me." His voice cracked like an old hinge. "Your mother and I built this place with our hands. You had no right. 8. For the first tie-in, I saw fear in Daniel's expression. He wasn't afraid of me. He was afraid of what this moment meant, that the truth had witnesses. I took a deep breath and laid one final paper on the table. I also spoke with the county clerk. Elder Affairs will be reviewing the transfer for coercion, which means the sale is frozen pending investigation. Today. Mel went pale. Kyle muttered a curse. Daniel's mouth opened, closed, then opened again, words scrambling for footing. You went to the authorities. I'm honest. Yes, I said simply. Because if you're so sure you did nothing wrong, you have nothing to fear. He do hires. Silence fell again deep, heavy, moral. Harold sat back, his hand trembling on the armrest. For a long tien, no one moved. Then he whispered, Anne, could you pour me some tea? Traxed. I nodded. In the kitchen, as I filled the kettle, I heard his voice drift through the doorway, tired but steady. You've shamed yourselves, he said. All of you. The house I'm leaving behind isn't worth much now, not because of the roof, but because of what's inside it. Is it connect? When I came back with his cup, no one spoke. Mel wiped her eyes. Kyle stared at the floor, and Daniel stood rigid, jaw clenched so tight the veins in his neck showed. Harold sipped his tea and said softly, Thank you, sweetheart. This tastes right. End quote. I sat beside Hyen, my hand resting over his. The tremor in his fingers eased. I felt Hyen reclaim a little of his dignity, the kind that doesn't come from property or pride, but from the simple act of being seen. After a while, I stood. I'll be going now, I said. Harold, I'll visit tomorrow. If Uber. Daniel started to follow me out, but I turned to Hyen. Don't, I said. You've said enough. I think the same. At the doorway, I looked back one last tie-in. Harold watched me with soft, tired eyes, the light from the window haloing Hyen in gold. Outside, the afternoon sun hit the maple leaves, turning them the color of forgiveness. The wind lifted the scent of lemon cake from the kitchen. I thought about all the Sundays I'd spent there, trying to belong. And for the first tie-in, I realized I already did, just not in the way I'd imagined. News in small towns doesn't spread, it seeps. By the end of that week, the Whitakers' family business wasn't just family business anymore. Someone from the county clerk's office had clearly talked to the local paper, and within 2 days, a small column appeared in the Maple Gazette. Elder fraud investigation opens concerning property transfer of Longtien resident Harold Whitaker. I have two head. It didn't name names, but everyone in town could connect the dots. Harold had been a deacon at the Methodist Church for 30 years. Daniel's company truck still had his last name painted across the side. Mel volunteered at the community center. Kyle played in the Friday bowling league. You couldn't swing a casserole dish without hitting a Whitaker. And suddenly, everyone was whispering. Daniel came home late that night, face tight with anger. Do you have any idea what you've done? He hissed. My boss asked if my own wife was trying to destroy my reputation. If they're proved it, I kept stirring my tea. Truth doesn't destroy. It just exposes what's already broken. After matters, he slammed a chair against the table, then stopped high himself like he remembered who he was supposed to be. Anne, he said, voice low. We can fix this. We'll return the money. Make a statement. But you need to retract that complaint. April. I didn't file it, I said quietly. The county clerk did automatically for. When she saw the sale price and the signatures. Well, he stared at me. You set it in motion. I wanted. I only lit the match, I said. You built the fire. Is minus. For once, Daniel didn't have a response. He left that night without a suitcase, just his wallet and his pride. I proved stay. We have writing reckoning as a daughters, and one. The following Sunday, I went to church with Harold. He insisted, even though I offered to stay home. If I can't walk into my own church with my head up, he said, then what's the point of getting old? I wise. When we arrived, conversations died like someone had turned down the volume knob on life. People looked and then looked away. But Harold smiled at them anyway, nodding, shaking hands. At the end of the service, Pastor Miller asked if he wanted to say a few words. Harold stood, steadying high on self with my arm. His voice wasn't strong, but it carried. Most of you've heard some things, he said. And most of them are true. I was tricked into signing papers I didn't understand by people I raised to know better. But the Lord says truth sets you free, and maybe that's what this is. Freedom. ATN 4. No one moved. Even the children stopped fidgeting. He looked at me then, eyes glassy but sure. If I've learned anything in 78 years, it's this. The people who keep your house standing aren't always the ones with their names on the deed. I guessed. He sat down to a wave of quiet murmurs, not gossip, this tie-in, but reverence. After the service, Mel tried to catch me in the parking lot. Her makeup was neat, but her hands shook. Anne, please. You made your point. They're threatening to prosecute Kyle for fraud. Describe. I looked at her, seeing the girl she once was proud, restless, used to winning small battles through charm. You made your choices, I said softly. You can still make better ones. It's not automated. Tears spilled down her cheeks. We were desperate. Daniel said Dad's care would bankrupt us. He said you'd understand if you knew. In Fort Withers, I do understand, I said. That's what makes it worse. It's one. She covered her face and sobbed, but I didn't comfort her, not out of cruelty, but because Somtieni's people need to feel the weight of what they've done before they can put it down. Mina servantsa, and had clated on Epps great trime. The next few weeks unfolded like slow justice. The investigation confirmed what I already knew. Harold's signature had been obtained under misleading pretenses. The sale was reversed. The deed restored, and the Whitaker siblings were ordered to repay the funds they'd withdrawn. Daniel tried to come home once, 2 days after the verdict. He knocked gently, like he was afraid of his own echo. When I opened the door, he stood there with tired eyes. I wanted to thank you, he said, for not pressing charges. 9. I didn't do it for you. I'm starred. He looked down. I know. I get it, Avers. Where will you go? I asked. Somewhere else, he said. Start over. I guess. It's not ground. He lingered a moment, searching my face for softness, but there was only stillness. You were a good wife, he said finally. Better than I deserved. 2. Off no. I nodded. I was a good woman. There's a difference. Is now there why? He left without another word. The sound of his footsteps on the porch faded until even the boards stopped remembering high-end. To I'd have in 2020-2022. To I dandiams and never dandiam. When summer came, Harold and I sat on the porch of his restored house, watching the sun dip low through the maple trees. The leaves shimmered like gold coins, catching the last light of day. They say the Lord repays in his own tie-in, Harold murmured. Maybe, I said. But sometimes he lets people do the math themselves. I'm serious. He chuckled softly, then grew serious. You could have left me to them. You know, most folks would have. I couldn't, I said. Your family. It's my 2- boarded. He nodded, thoughtful. You know, my late wife used to say being family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up when things get ugly. I have sighed. The cicadas started up their low hum. The air smelled of warm earth and lemon loaf cooling inside. I thought about everything that had broken and everything that had quietly held. That night, as I drove home, I passed the office of Marlowe Realty. The sign in the window still advertised honest homes, honest deals. I almost laughed. Then I realized something. Honesty isn't a slogan. It's the sound a latch makes when it finally closes right. Thanks for watching, and it's this of the pensing. The Whitakers never fully recovered their standing in town. Mel sold her house and moved 2 counties over. Kyle switched jobs. Daniel disappeared into a city where last names meant nothing. But Harold kept his home. And every Sunday, I brought Hyan his tea lemon slice, shortbread, pills lined up in a row. He always smiled and said, "You remember everything." I have the Scrum way. And I always answered, "I listen. I was create." Because that's how it started, and that's how I learned the truth. When the dust finally settled, it wasn't triumph that I felt, it was quiet. Not the kind that comes from peace, not yet. The kind that arrives when a storm has passed, and you stand among the broken branches, knowing what's gone can't be put back the same way. After the investigation closed, Harold's name was restored as the rightful owner of his home. The county helped Hyan set up a new power of attorney, this tie-in with me listed, and a legal aid witness present. He cried a little when he signed it, his hands shaking. "It should have been Daniel," he said softly. "No," I told Hyan. "It should have been someone who loved you. Is been my friend." He nodded, eyes glistening, and for the first tie-in, I saw Hyan not as a father-in-law but as an old man who'd been betrayed by his own blood and still managed to forgive them in his heart. I didn't have that grace yet. So there's a by Dodd on the Kamini cases of Radius. The weeks turned into months. Harold's health declined. Slowly but predictably, I visited every day after work, reading to Hyan from the newspaper, cooking small meals he could manage, keeping the house alive around Hyan. He'd often drift in and out of sleep mid-conversation, his voice fading like a signal losing strength. But even then, he always remembered to say thank you, always remembered to ask if I was eating enough. One evening, as the last light pooled on the wooden floor, he said, "You know, when your mother-in-law was sick, I used to think about what would happen to the house when we were both gone. I never imagined it'd come to this." And quote, I reached over, took his hand. "You don't need to think about that now. Asn't." He smiled faintly. "I already have. I called the lawyer this morning. I'm leaving it to you. Today." My throat tightened. "Harold, no." "Yes," he said gently. "You've earned it more than anyone else. You kept this family's name clean when the rest of us dirtied it." Tears burned my eyes. "I don't want your house, Harold. It's dead to be my spotted." He squeezed my fingers. "It's not the house I'm leaving you. It's proof that decency can outlast bloodlines. It's Christofinen." I didn't argue again. Sometimes the only way to honor someone's love is to accept it quietly. It's conclated or resented. When he passed away that autumn, the world didn't stop, it just softened. The leaves turned the color of rust and honey, and the house grew still. The funeral was small, by his request. Mel came, head bowed, face pale. Kyle stood behind her, expression hollow. Daniel didn't show. After the service, Mel approached me. "He left it all to you, didn't he?" she asked, voice brittle. "Yes," I said simply. She nodded, then whispered, "Maybe that's fair." Preston won. We stood there, 2 women, connected by the same grief, but separated by everything else. "He forgave you," I said quietly. She blinked. "How do you know?" "Because he couldn't have died so peacefully if he hadn't." End quote. She covered her face and cried. Real tears, this Tien. And for a moment, I saw not the woman who schemed and lied, but a daughter who'd lost her father and finally understood what that meant. I didn't hug her, but I didn't walk away either. We just stood there until the wind carried the last of the church bells into silence. If you have parity in 99, if you have defor that is era 1 to y with 2 that. After the funeral, I moved into the house full tieni. At first, it felt wrong, like I was trespassing in someone else's story. The furniture still smelled faintly of Harold's cologne, and the walls carried echoes of the life that had come before me. But slowly, I made it mine. I repainted the kitchen a soft sage green. I planted new hydrangeas in the front yard, the same color as the ones in the old family photos. On Sundays, I opened the windows and let the light fall across the floorboards. Dust motes dancing like memories you don't need to chase anymore. I started writing again small essays, reflections about caregiving, about trust, about the quiet endurance of women who are underestimated until they aren't. I posted one online, then another. Soon, people began to write back, strangers who saw themselves in my words. They told me stories about their mothers, their in-laws, the battles they'd fought for love and respect. Some were still angry. Some had found peace. But every story felt like a hand reaching across a long table, saying, I know that kind of pain too. And that connection, that invisible sisterhood of truth-tellers, began to heal something inside me that even justice couldn't touch. It's for maybe a new maybe dayers. One evening, nearly a year after Harold's passing, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea. The maple trees rustled overhead, leaves whispering secrets to the wind. I looked at the empty chair beside me and smiled. I kept the house warm, I said softly. Just like you wanted. I-I-O. Somewhere, a screen door banged in the distance, someone else's family gathering, someone else's noise. Mine was quiet now, but not empty. The kind of quiet that means you've learned to breathe again. I thought about Daniel Somtienes, wondered if he ever found peace, if guilt ever caught up with Hyen, or if he just learned to live with it. But I never reached out. Some stories don't need an epilogue. Instead, I built something new, a life that didn't revolve around being someone's wife, or someone's daughter-in-law, just me. And for the first Hyen in years, that was enough. When I finally went inside that night, I turned off the lights one by one. The last sound before the house settled into darkness was the soft, certain click of a latch sliding into place, firm, honest, final. Sometiens. When people hear my story, they call me brave. But bravery, I've learned, doesn't always look like shouting the truth from rooftops. Sometiens. It's sitting across from a liar and refusing to blink first. Sometiens. It's choosing dignity over revenge. When I look back now, I don't see villains and victims. I see weak people making desperate choices, and one woman who finally decided to stop being quiet about them. Because silence may keep the peace, but it also keeps the rot. Harold once told me that honesty takes longer, but it's cheaper in the end. He was right. The cost of lies always comes due in shame, in guilt, in empty houses where love used to live. There's a photo that still hangs in the hallway. Harold sitting in his chair, sunlight on his face, eyes soft with forgiveness. Every Hyen I pass it, I remember that the real inheritance he left me wasn't the house. It was the reminder that you can rebuild a life after betrayal, not by erasing what happened, but by refusing to let it define who you are next. So when people ask me if I ever forgave Daniel and his family, I tell them this. Forgiveness doesn't mean letting someone back in. It means letting yourself move on without carrying their sin like a souvenir. And I did. Now, when I pour tea in the quiet kitchen, I can almost hear Harold's voice again, calm, teasing, wise. You always remember the lemon is 80er. Yes, I do. Because life, like tea, is meant to be steeped, not rushed. And if you wait long enough, even bitterness can turn into something warm. Would you have done what I did? Would you have exposed them? Or stayed silent to keep the peace? Tell me in the comments. And if my story reminded you that truth always finds its way home, don't forget to subscribe so you can hear the next one. Because behind every closed door, there's another story waiting to be told.